Whenever I think of underrated horror films, Candyman is one of the first names that comes to mind. And yet, that feels like an odd thing to say. Both the character and the urban legend are pretty well known. In fact, it's possible that someone's speaking his name in a mirror right now and has no idea where the myth came from. But what about the 1992 film? Though often overlooked, Candyman was an ambitious and creative venture, combining elements of the slasher, the ghost story, and the gothic tradition. It took an original tale by Clive Barker and fused his ideas with real-world locations, popular myths, and true events, blurring the lines between fact and fantasy. The film worked as a deconstruction of urban legends while simultaneously creating one of its own. So today, let's give Candyman some of the attention that I think it deserves. Before we start, there will be spoilers for the first film. However, the second and third Candyman movies will be joining Exorcist 2 in my let's pretend these sequels never existed pile. Part 1. Making the Monster from book to film. Candyman was based on The Forbidden, a 1985 short story set in Clive Barker's home city of Liverpool. In an impoverished housing estate, a graduate student named Helen is taking photographs for her thesis. During her research, the residents tell her about some strange events that happened in the area, including a dead man who had been butchered with a hook. Helen recounts the tale over dinner to her husband Trevor and his academic colleagues, who dismiss it as urban legend. Fueled by her growing obsession, Helen continues to return to the estate and finds herself drawn to an abandoned apartment. There, she encounters the spectral figure known as the Candyman. Several aspects of the original Candyman character were carried over to the movie, such as his hook for a hand, the live bees inside his chest cavity, and the alluring, almost hypnotic quality of his voice. Beyond that, his physical appearance varies quite drastically. Here's how he was described in the book. He was bright to the point of gaudiness, his flesh a waxy yellow, his thin lips pale blue, his wild eyes glittering as if their irises were set with rubies. His jacket was a patchwork, his trousers the same. He looked, she thought, almost ridiculous, with his blood-stained motley and the hint of rouge on his jaundiced cheeks. Barker's original concept provides some striking mental imagery. I'm sure there's an artist out there who could do it justice. But while it works in the short fiction format, both the story and character had to be fleshed out in order to support a full-length feature film. So, how did Candyman evolve from page to screen? Arguably the most significant change was the setting, which moved from the fictional Spectre Street estate in England to the real-life Cabrini Green housing project in Chicago. While changing locations is quite common when filming adaptations, it's usually done for practical or commercial reasons. And it's not without risk, as the new cultural backdrop might not suit the material. Results can be disastrous. However, that wasn't the case when it came to Candyman. The urban landscape added a sense of realism, with many scenes shot on location and Cabrini Green's own residents appearing on screen. It also inspired a significant event in the film's backstory, the murder of Ruthie Jean, which was based on a real-life incident. Additionally, Cabrini's atmosphere created what the director described as palpable fear, thanks to the area's violent reputation. And indeed, the crew reported that their truck was shot at during filming. Making horror doesn't get scarier than that. Thematically, the film managed to stay true to the book's key ideas while expanding and enriching them. The theme of social inequality and the anxieties of venturing into the wrong neighbourhood are central to both versions. For the first half of the story, Helen is able to return to her comfortable middle-class home, safe from the squalor and danger of the haunted housing estate. Tension grows as she's drawn in deeper, and the barriers between worlds become blurred and broken. Inspired by its new setting, the film introduced another theme: racial inequality. This transformed the Candyman character and inspired his backstory, something that had been missing from the book. Told in universe, Candyman was an artist and the son of a former slave. He was murdered and mutilated by an angry mob, all for the crime of loving a rich white woman. His spirit, which still bears the injuries inflicted upon him, reflects a dark and violent past. The look of Candyman was completely revamped. Gone was the wild-eyed, multicoloured ghost from the book. The new Candyman was a complex creation, elegant as well as bloodthirsty, and a victim as well as a monster. He was played by Tony Todd, a former stage actor standing at 6'5". As well as his naturally imposing presence, Todd brought depth and gravitas to the role, not to mention his distinctive, bone-chilling voice. Thanks to his performance, Candyman became one of the most iconic horror villains of the 90s. Had the studio gone with their first choice, Eddie Murphy, the result would have been quite different to say the least. Part 2. Urban Legends. 90s horror had a fascination with deconstruction and metafiction, telling stories within stories. Characters would openly discuss urban legends or other scary movies and attempt to break down the tropes of the genre. However, they were still trapped within a horror film, so this knowledge couldn't save them from their own predicament. Candyman was one of the first to do this and, in my opinion, did it best. Urban legends are at the heart of Candyman. The stories literally give him power. Almost everything about his design, from his hooked hand to his connection with mirrors, has its roots in modern myth. Helen, on the other hand, is concerned with the academic study of urban legends and attempts to analyse and debunk Candyman. This does not go according to plan. A number of existing urban legends are referenced throughout the film. Let's go through them one at a time. The Hook, or Hookman. There are variations of this story, but it typically starts with a teenage couple hearing an emergency radio broadcast. An escaped killer, with a hook for a hand, is on the loose. The story often ends with the couple driving home to find a bloody hook hanging from the car door, unlike the version I first heard, which involved a bit more decapitation. The Hook was one of the scary stories Clive Barker enjoyed telling as a child, and we can see that homage in Candyman's design. Bloody Mary. Candyman is said to appear if you say his name in the mirror 5 times. Later in the film, Helen is summoned using the same method. This is similar to Bloody Mary, a ritual in which the name is spoken in front of a mirror to invoke the supernatural, either for fear or fortune-telling. I discussed the creepiness of mirrors before in my Oculus video, so if that interests you, then give it a watch. And now I'm wondering what would happen if you summoned Candyman using the laser glass. Worst sleepover ever. The Babysitter. Slasher films hate babysitters. They're always being slaughtered by masked maniacs, angry ghosts, or other intruders. Give them a break, they're just trying to earn a bit of cash. Urban legends have the same contempt for teen girls' safety, and this is how the film introduces Candyman, as the villain in a classic babysitter story. The girl who summoned him did so after she invited a boy to the house. He ended up finding the bodies. This is, again, typical of urban legends. These stories often double as cautionary tales, so bad things happen to horny teenagers. Razor blades in the candy. Stories of Halloween treats containing poison or pointy things have done the rounds for decades. Though virtually every report gets debunked, media panic would resume every October. Parents were warned to be extra careful as they dressed up their children in little costumes and sent them outside to take treats from strangers. Brightly wrapped candies, or sweets as we'd say in the UK, are found in Candyman's lair. When Helen inspects them, she finds razor blades. Given the timing of this event in the book, it occurs shortly before bonfire night, the sweets would have been placed there around Halloween. This is all part of a recurring motif. Whenever sweets are mentioned, you know something bad is about to happen. The escaped mental patient. Scary stories about deranged killers who fled confinement are as old as the institutions themselves. The twist here is the escaped madman or madwoman happens to be the protagonist. Helen escapes the hospital after stealing a staff member's uniform. She goes to her apartment, scares the crap out of her husband's new squeeze, and disses the new colour scheme. Yeah, I don't like it either. Helen might be an escaped mental patient, but is she crazy? We'll come back to that question later. Hair turned white from shock. Though medically impossible, tales of traumatised people whose hair turned white have been around since Marie Antoinette. It's a minor detail, but it does appear in 2 separate stories. First, when the teenage boy finds the babysitter, and second, to the witness of the Cabrini Green bathroom scene. And no, rhyming doesn't make that moment any less horrifying. The choking Doberman. This one might be a stretch, but I thought it was worth including. In this story, a woman lives alone with a large, fierce dog. She takes the choking animal to the vet, who finds human fingers lodged in its throat. Back in her apartment, she finds a stranger's body, passed out from blood loss after having his fingers bitten off. Anne-Marie's apartment is guarded by a similar dog, though it's a Rottweiler rather than a Doberman. However, the tables are turned. The dog might have been able to subdue a living intruder who arrived at the home with his fingers intact, but Candyman has the upper hand, so to speak. Anne-Marie's pet joins Bugsy and Mason in the horrible canine fatalities I've had to watch to make these videos. Please, no more dead dogs. The supporting characters of Candyman are also engaged in the study of urban legends. We get to hear part of Trevor's lecture on the subject as the freshmen discuss the topic of sewer alligators. During this scene, Trevor's notes are displayed in the background. Each one of them can be directly applied to the Candyman myth, but they also foreshadow the legend of Helen. Here's what they say. Number 1. Some, if only a little, basis of truth. In the present day, we see at least one gang leader has adopted the Candyman persona and used it to commit real acts of violence. But what about the root of the myth? Candyman's death might have been based on a true event, as many black men were attacked and killed by lynch mobs. The precise details, such as the hook and the honeycomb, may be embellished, but it's possible that somebody witnessed similar acts of brutality and passed the story on to others. The small basis of truth is also key to the mural of Helen, which is shown during the closing credits. The people of Cabrini Green did witness a woman emerge from a bonfire with her hair ablaze, though it looked a little different in reality. Number 2. Often a victim seeking revenge. Candyman's spirit is a vengeful one due to his violent and unjust death. He has suffered, and so he is prepared to shed innocent blood. But while Candyman kills indiscriminately, sometimes revenge is a bit more personal. Helen hath no fury like a woman scorned. Number 3. Resides in a forbidden area, sometimes to keep children from the area. Cabrini Green is established as a forbidden area long before the characters even set foot there. Both Candyman and Helen can be said to reside there, as they both died on the grounds. However, there's an alternative angle. Jake believes that Candyman lives in Cabrini's public bathrooms, the place where a young boy was mutilated. Another victim, Ruthie Jean, was murdered in her bathtub. Candyman later attacks Helen in her home bathroom, the same place where Helen will return to kill Trevor. The bathroom connection is interesting. An occupied bathroom is considered a forbidden area to everyone but the occupant. It's a private place where we feel vulnerable. Just try taking a shower after watching Psycho. As for Jake's story about the boy in the bathroom, this actually came from the author's grandmother, who told him this story to keep him away from public toilets. Granny Barker must have been a very scary woman. Also, emphasis on the word forbidden. I see what you did there. Number 4. Deformities. Candyman has a hooked hand and a chest filled with live bees, 2 graphic reminders of how he died. Likewise, the ghost of Helen appears with her head and hands covered in burn scars. Number 5. Appliances, blades, hooks, etc. For Candyman, this part is self-explanatory, but it also applies to Helen, who inherits the hook after his demise, then uses it to kill her husband. In short, Trevor basically predicted the story of his own death. Not that it did him any good in the end. Part 3. It was always you, Helen. One of my favourite things about Candyman is its ambiguity, something that got lost in the sequels I choose to ignore. In the first film, we see the whole story through the eyes of Helen Lyle, whose research draws her to the Candyman myth. As she gets closer, terrible things start to happen. To Helen, she's the only one who can see the truth, that the Candyman legend is real and she's being stalked by a dangerous supernatural being. To the outside world, it seems that the bright young graduate student has lost her mind and become a danger to herself and those around her. Is Candyman real? Did Helen go insane? And what was meant by the cryptic message, "It was always you, Helen"? The answers to these questions depend on how you read the film. Scenario 1. Candyman is real. The events play out exactly as we see them on screen. Helen summons Candyman, who later appears to her and places her in a trance. He kills Anne-Marie's dog and Bernadette, or perhaps forces Helen to carry out these acts while under his spell. He abducts baby Anthony, keeps him alive while Helen is under sedation, then kills a doctor after being summoned a second time. He returns to Cabrini Green, places the baby in the unlit bonfire, and waits for Helen to appear. Before his spirit is vanquished, his desire is for Helen, himself, and the baby to burn together. Now we've established Candyman's actions, we're left with a few questions. Why is he doing this? Why did he appear to Helen but not kill her? Aside from the obvious answer, because the movie would be too short, Candyman must have another purpose for Helen, or he has attached some sort of significance to her. His motivation comes down to at least one of three things: anger, fear, and desire. Calm and contented individuals don't usually rip people open with hooks. Candyman's ghost carries the rage at his unjust death, along with an insatiable thirst for vengeance. And Helen has done plenty to anger him. She doubted his story, intruded into his lair, and summoned him from the grave as a joke. Worst of all, she is actively trying to disprove the legend, as she did in her last conversation with Jake. This brings us to our next factor: fear. Destroying the myth could mean the end of Candyman, and Helen's work is putting his immortality at risk. As her research has already been shared with her colleagues and has started to gain attention, killing Helen won't be enough to stop it. Instead, Candyman discredits Helen by making her look insane, and he kills her research partner for good measure. However, fear may be a goal in itself, as Helen's fear might be helping to restore Candyman's power. Terrifying someone to the brink of insanity before killing them, also known as the Pennywise method, might be Candyman's motive. In either case, Candyman's evil deeds occur as a result of Helen's actions. Hence the phrase, "It was always you, Helen. All of this is your fault." Now we come to the third motivation: desire. The way Candyman speaks to Helen is seductive in nature. This could just be a method used to entice his victim, but for the moment, let's assume that Candyman's expression is genuine. It makes sense. After all, his spirit has been alone for centuries, and in life, Candyman wanted love and compassion. Instead, he was met with prejudice and abuse. Candyman joins the long tradition of villains born of human cruelty, such as Frankenstein's monster, Carrie White, and the Phantom of the Opera. Each story is a grim reflection of how society treats its outcasts. So, why Helen? It might be as simple as the fact that she was there. She summoned him, and he developed an attachment to her. And it's easy to see why. She's intelligent, beautiful, and has a cheating scumbag of a husband who doesn't deserve her. With him out of the picture, her best friend dead, and her reputation destroyed, the material world no longer has a hold on Helen. Candyman has her all to himself. But there's something else going on, at least in Candyman's mind. In his lair, we see the painting of a woman who looks eerily like Helen. It may or may not have been there before. It's implied that this woman was Candyman's lover, who became pregnant with his child before he died. It's also possible, or Candyman might believe, that Helen is her reincarnation. This all works onto the assumption that Candyman was, in fact, a real person, and that his story has been recounted in flawless detail. Just a reminder, we're ignoring the sequels. Candyman might just have been born out of pure myth, and sees Helen as the missing part in his own pantheon. Whatever his reason, it all culminates in Candyman's twisted effort to unite himself, his lover, and the baby in the fire. It was always you, Helen. You were always the one. Scenario 2. There is no Candyman. In this version, Helen is undergoing a mental breakdown. She suffers from hallucinations and blackouts where she can't remember or control her actions. During these blackouts, she cuts off a dog's head, stabs her friend to death, and abducts and possibly kills a small child. Helen can't come to terms with what she's doing, so she invents another persona who she believes is responsible for her own violent acts. This scenario leaves us with more questions. What made Helen snap in the first place? And what actually happens in the film from this point onward? Breakdowns can happen for any number of reasons. Technically, there doesn't have to be a cause. People can develop mental health problems for any reason or no reason at all, which is one of the scariest things about them. But what, if anything, could have happened to Helen? She may have lost her grip on reality through her obsession with gory stories and violent crime. This doesn't seem likely, as Helen seems to maintain a healthy degree of skepticism and detachment from her research. Could we attribute her breakdown to stress and anxiety? Possibly. She's under pressure to deliver on her thesis, especially as she's surrounded by academics even in her personal life. She might also be feeling anxious about her marriage, as she shows a few hints of suspicion towards Trevor. However, this is a minor detail early in the film and doesn't seem to be a big enough factor on its own. If anything, it's more likely to be a combination of all of the above. One last thing that might have affected Helen was the massive head trauma she suffered after being beaten with a metal hook. Neurological damage can, in some cases, trigger a drastic change in personality. Who knows? Maybe we'd all be seeing Candyman after that blow to the skull. So if there is no Candyman, how do we explain all of the events in the film's third act? One theory is that Helen never left the hospital. The remainder of the story is a drug-induced fabrication of Helen's mind, where she plays out her anxieties and attempts to redeem herself for the worst of her crimes. This is supported by a shift in the film's logic, as well as a plot hole regarding baby Anthony. Up until Helen is incarcerated, Candyman's actions could have been performed by a human, albeit one who has lost control of her senses and can't remember anything. Had the film followed its previous pattern, Helen would have woken up outside the hospital with no memory, wearing a nurse's uniform. This doesn't happen. Instead, we have the scene in the doctor's office that changes everything. First, Helen sees video footage of herself shouting at an invisible Candyman. This confirms that other people can't see him and that he doesn't appear on camera. Candyman then murders the doctor right before Helen's eyes. Before now, she's always blacked out and has never actually watched him kill anyone. Finally, Candyman uses his hook to remove Helen's restraints before breaking a window, interacting with the environment in ways he hasn't done before. If Candyman isn't real, then Helen's hallucinations have become far more warped and vivid than ever before. After a month in hospital, she's somehow crazier than ever. However, in this state, she still has the wits to escape from a secure building, unassisted and undetected. The following scene, where Helen returns to her apartment, might play out exactly as we see it, or it may be another construct of Helen's mind. So why would she imagine this? It might be Helen's anxieties at work, as she imagines being completely usurped by some student she met only one time, very briefly. Her paranoia might simply have latched itself onto the first attractive freshman she saw in Trevor's class. Maybe Trevor did cheat before and Helen knew it, or she feels betrayed because her husband abandoned her in the hospital. Either way, Helen has created a space in her mind to confront Trevor and express her anger, something she might not get to do in real life. Couple that with the revenge fantasy at the film's end, and there you have it. Helen has closure. Now we reach the plot hole that is baby Anthony. Without Candyman's help, how did the baby survive long enough to be rescued by Helen? This might be an adaptation issue, so let's look at the book's counterpart, baby Kerry. The thing is, Kerry didn't make it. Helen found him dead in Candyman's lair and then later returned to retrieve his body from the bonfire. So how does that work if we're still attributing all of Candyman's actions to Helen? Well, the only explanation is that the baby she rescued was already dead. Perhaps the film originally meant to follow through on this narrative, but I can understand why they didn't. Whether or not she ever left the hospital, Helen is confronted with the truth she's trying to avoid. It was always you, Helen. There is no Candyman, and never was. It was always you, in the darkness, all alone. Thanks for listening, and happy Halloween to you all. Anyone else revisiting an old horror classic or recently discovered some new nightmare fuel? 'Tis the season after all. As always, if you have any suggestions for future videos, then feel free to leave a comment, and if you enjoyed this video, then please like, subscribe or share if you have friends who also like overanalyzing creepy stuff. Till next time, good night and careful what you say in front of mirrors.